So I wanted to talk about recession, rolling recession, the Fed, interest rates. In order to have this conversation, I have the one and only Mr. Greg Dickerson. How you doing, sir?
Doing great, Michael. Good to see you.
Nice to see you as well. So I think the Fed is winning. I think we've seen peak inflation, which again, headline peak was 9.1. I believe the last read was 6.5. We've had 4 or 5 months in clear decrease. I do think that inflation's about to get harder, right? We're not going to see the big jumps as we move from core goods inflation or deflation to housing to wages. But how do you look at inflation? Do you think the Fed is winning? Do you think there's maybe a spike in the future that we don't see coming? What does Greg think about inflation?
Yeah, so right now it's still trending down, but it's still above 6%. There's one school of thought out there that says we're going to have a double top,
Oh,
inflation
yeah.
with the reopening as China reopens and things like that. And as the dollar continues to weaken, that's obviously, an inflationary situation.
Yeah.
The weaker the dollar gets, the less you can buy. So, that's putting pressure on inflation. So I think it's going to be very difficult. I'm not sure, I don't know. Nobody knows, what's going to happen. Gas prices. So the reason it's come down, gas prices is number one. That's the biggest, thing
No
that's
doubt.
reduced inflation. And then there, some sort of the housing component, they reduced it somehow. And you're starting to see reports, on rents coming down in some areas of the country. So that's affecting it a little bit. But at the end of the day, the things that matter the most, that people are spending the most money on, food, shelter, the cost of that shelter,
Yeah.
to stay in a house, whether you're renting or owning, the utilities, things like that, clothing, all the different things are still not cheap. Eating out services, all those types of things. Gas is still not cheap. Gas is still, it's come down, but it's still higher than where it really has been for the last few years before the pandemic and where it should be. And then the caveat is with China reopening, with that amount of product going to, flood the market, is that going to create actual inflation because there's more stuff coming and more people spending? And then number three, the consumer's stubborn. People don't believe that there's a recession coming because everybody's still out, everybody's still spending, things are still good. So, as long as people are still spending and as long as those other things are still happening, we're going to see inflation decline rapidly, below that 4% level, which is where it really needs to get to before the Fed can really think about, pulling the foot off the gas and, stop it. I mean, they've got a couple more rate hikes coming, might be 50, might be 25. As we get closer, we're going to know. Lael Brainard's coming out this week on Thursday. So you're going to hear what the most dovish member of the Fed is thinking. And, she's going to come and, talk the markets. She will browbeat the markets because,
Oh,
they
yeah.
don't want to see easing of financial conditions. So the Fed's going to do just what they did last time. They're going to continue that message. Inflation's too high. We're not cutting rates. We're going to keep them higher longer because the markets still don't believe the Fed. That's the bottom line of what's going on. Davos right now, most investors out there, they still think the Fed is going to start backtracking here as soon as we start getting into a recession. So, that's the real question. And I can't give you that answer because I don't believe them either,
Yeah.
based on their historical track record. And that's really the problem, is they don't have that credibility. So they're going to have to, they're in a position now to where they're going to have to continue to talk tough to get tightening financial conditions. And they're going to have to back that up, because if they don't, then, you're going to have chaos because you don't have an institution that anybody can rely on for monetary policy.
Yeah. Yeah, when I look at inflation, our first topic, I think I've always said there's an easy component, which is just about done. There's a hard component, which will take us through the summer. And then there's the really hard stuff, which is probably more a year in the making, because I think wage inflation, I think structural deglobalization, I think all of these things take years to play out. So yeah, getting sub 4%, certainly getting sub 3.5 is going to be really, really hard. So let's talk
The only
about the
way to
Fed.
do that is the Fed has to take their terminal rate higher than inflation. That's the only way to do it. So, from the economic standpoint, until they do that, inflation really can't start coming down, and markets can't bottom, and we won't understand where the recession is until we get those elements. If there's going to be one, how deep, how long, how short, how shallow, all those things. And then, by the way, we still have geopolitical issues all around the world. You have potential global conflict majorly, in a bunch of different areas, and the global power kind of aligning different ways based on the outcome of Russia-Ukraine. So, there's a lot of things yet on the horizon that can really put a wrench in things if one or two things, kind of fall here or there. The Bank of Japan, that's a big one that's kind of teetering.
Yeah,
That people don't realize the effect that could have, but if they crack, that will send shock waves through
for
the
sure.
global economy. Not as big as the United States did in '09, but big enough to kind of spook people for a little bit. And
Oh yeah, it'll cause a problem. That'll
yeah,
leave a mark for sure.
so it's
Uh,
it's a fascinating year. Once again, we really don't know. What we do know is all things equal, inflation's still too high. Everything is still too high. It's still putting a lot of pressure on the average wage earner, and there is no sign that any of that's going to be coming down anytime soon.
Yeah, I agree with that. Then I go to the Fed. I personally think there's two more rate hikes ahead of us. I think we're going to get a quarter February 1st. I think we'll get a quarter middle of March. And then my personal belief is there's no cuts. I think the rest of the year is a pause. In fact, I think there's a greater chance of a third rate hike than a rate cut. That's currently what I see. Because again, the Fed has no credibility. To your point, I think the Fed funds rate will be above inflation come the summer, so that'll give them cover to pause. But what do you think about that?
So I think that right now is accurate. They're targeting 5%, 5.25, terminal rate. So we're almost there. A couple more 25 basis point rate hikes. We're there.
Okay.
I think what they'll tell you is we're not coming down at all. We might pause,
Oh,
we might slow the
yes.
pace, but we're not backing up at all. The other thing that nobody has talked about, including the Fed, and they've deliberately stayed away from it, is QT. So they're not
Yes.
sucking liquidity out of the markets. In other words, they're not selling their assets, at scale right now. So, they're rolling off a little bit here and there, mortgage-backed securities, these other things, and that's going to put further pressure on,
Mhm.
the cost of credit and things like that. So, I mean, there's still a few things out there lurking, but right now, I don't think they're going to cut rates and back up at all in this year
Yeah.
unless they have to. And if they have to, that's not a good thing.
I agree with that statement. If the Fed has to cut this year, trust me, it ain't for a good reason. It is something bad. Yeah, I agree with that. And then the last thing I want to talk about is unemployment, because I think what we're suffering through is something I'm calling a rolling recession. A rolling recession, as I define it, is different industries are hit at different times, unlike what we saw in March of 2020, or we saw in the Great Recession, where it was just everybody was hard down like overnight. I think this is going to be much more like the dot-com crisis, which was kind of 3 years and death by 1,000 cuts. That was an example of a rolling recession. I'm not sure we'll actually have negative GDP, because again, the rolling recession, some industries will good while others are bad. Um, what do you think? Do you think we're heading off a cliff, or do you see kind of a shallow slog stagflation for quarters or years?
Yeah, from an unemployment standpoint,
Yeah, unemployment and yeah,
yeah.
GDP.
So yeah, I think right now we're seeing steady declines in certain sectors, but the job market is still so far out of balance. How do you fix that in a year? How do you
Yeah.
get to the point to where there's more people than jobs, in a year when there's still probably 3 or 4 to 1 in certain sectors, so where you're seeing the layoffs is in, high end tech where they were bloated anyways. They had too many employees anyways. You're not seeing layoffs at the core manufacturing level, service level, construction even yet, with what's going on. We're not seeing, we can talk about the housing market next if you want to do a
Mhm.
bonus,
Sure.
video while we're here. We'll get into that there. But the labor market that really matters from a recessionary standpoint, we're not seeing any cracks, stress, or any kind of even a correction, much less, stabilization. So a lot of work left to do. I don't know how the Fed fixes that without really destroying the economy.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think we're headed for a white collar recession. As you've told us, right? The blue collar area, it's plenty of jobs out there. Wages are going up. Um, Deglobalization will actually bring more jobs home. So, yeah, the Fed's got a tough job. And in fact, let's be clear, they created a lot of it. They stayed too low for too long. They were in the market 6 months longer than they should have been. And we're all paying the price for this. But yeah, this 2023 is going to be an interesting year. I think it's a year of very low growth, might not even be negative. I think unemployment kind of stays below 4.5, currently at 3.5. And I think on average, labor wins. I think labor will see real wage growth this year, not only nominal but real wage growth as inflation comes in. So It's a wild year. I'm glad you're here when we can get you. Where can people follow you?
Yeah. And before I get to that,
Sure.
what's really important about these layoffs to understand. So this is everything's lagging. So everything the Fed's doing is going to lag. It's going to take time for the interest rate hikes, all these things, liquidity drawdown. It's going to take year or years for that to roll through the economy. The people that are getting laid off now are getting laid off with severance. They've either got
Yes.
6 months to a year, 2 years. All of them, except for maybe like some Amazon, holiday fill-in workers, things like that. Again, the real layoffs at Main Street level that really affect the economy, that hasn't happened yet.
Not
And,
yet.
hopefully it won't without having to correct things. But, so these layoffs that are happening now, these people can sit around for 6 months to a year. Some of them already had 2-3 jobs anyways, that are tech workers and, things like that, doing, virtual work and remote work and things of that nature. So, I think I agree with your point. It's just going to lag. But to answer your question, gregdickerson.com, that's where everything lives. Go check it out.
Thank you very much. We'll talk about housing next. Thank you so much.